Hey y'all! In this video I'm going to take a few steps back and we're going to get into some of the basics. I've had several requests lately that have to do with working with text, especially when it comes to node editing. I have a simple VCarve project that I need to do for my wife. She wants some fence art to hang out in her flower bed, and she's come up with this sign. It's rather simple V carving of text here in two different fonts, and cut out kind of a rustic shape to the piece of material. So we're going to get into how to design this outline here, this profile cutout, and do some node editing on the text. So let's go on ahead over to a new session of Aspire. I'm using Aspire 9.5 for this video. However, everything I'm going to show you is done identically in VCarve Desktop and VCarve Pro. So the steps are the same. We'll get into it here by creating a new file. Now I'm going to be carving this in a fence board, an old piece of a cedar fence board. And the working area that I have in this piece of material is about 29.5 inches long. I can kind of fudge this a little bit because I need a little bit of extra space out here on the ends to be able to fasten the material down to my CNC table. So for this file, I'm going to make my width in X 30 inches wide. My height in Y is 9 inches. My material thickness is a nominal 3/4 of an inch because I'm going to be setting my Z0 to the material surface. The toolpath will be calculated to carve down from that 0. So the actual thickness of my material is not as important as if I were doing a 3D model. Again, I'm going to set my Z0 to the material surface. For layout purposes, my XY datum will be in the center, but before I calculate the toolpaths, I will change that over to the bottom left corner. Because again, that's where I set my X, Y, and Z0 outside on the machine. We'll go ahead and click OK. So now the first thing I want to do is I want to define the border of my actual sign I'm going to be carving. So we'll come over here into Create Vectors, and we'll draw a rectangle. Now I want the anchor point of that rectangle to be the center of the rectangle, and I want that center on my X0, Y0. I want square corners, and I want about an inch out here and out here to be able to fasten the material down and not be concerned with the bit running into a screw. So I'm going to make my width in X 28 inches, but I want the height in Y to be my material. So we'll go ahead and leave that at 9 inches. And I'll click Create. Now I can close this, and if I come over here and select that rectangle, we can see what we have here. Let me go back over to the other file for just a minute. Now, when I shaped this profile here, it's kind of abstract and freeform. I may not be able to duplicate this exactly, but that's okay. One of the advantages of doing it this way is I may come up with an outline shape here, a profile, that I prefer over this one. That's one of the benefits of making more than one copy of a file, especially if it's something that you can't duplicate exactly. So what we'll do is we'll get in here and we're going to do some node editing on this rectangle because I don't want a rectangle. I want that rustic kind of sculpted weather-worn look. So with my rectangle selected, I'll type the letter N on my keyboard to go into node editing mode. And when I do that, we bring up these 4 points or nodes out here on the corners. And we'll notice we have a green point down here with an arrow pointing in this direction. This indicates that this is the start point, and that arrow indicates which direction this vector was drawn. It will run this direction. This be the start point, second, third, fourth point, but then back returning to the start point. I want to kind of break up the outline here and make that rustic look. So I'm going to need to do that by inserting more points and moving the vectors around in between those points. I'm going to start down here just to kind of get the bottom surface figured out. I don't want to change this just yet, but I'll come out here about to right there. That looks good. And there's no cut and dried measurement here. It's just whatever looks good to you. And I'll right click with my cursor over that vector. And I'll come down here to insert a point. Now we see right here I've got the letter I. This is the keyboard shortcut. I'm going to remember that and show you something here. But I want to insert a point right there where I clicked. And that inserted this point right here. Now you notice when I get my cursor up over that point, it changes to this set of crosshairs. I can grab that point by clicking and holding my left mouse button, and we see it turns red. And I can drag that point over here if I choose to. What that has effectively done is it's made this a span of the vector, and now this is a separate span of the vector. To manipulate the vector in a certain direction without changing this shape down here, I want this to stay more or less straight, I'll need another vector. So I'll come over here, put my cursor, the tip of my cursor over this span of the vector, and remembering that keyboard shortcut, I'll just type the letter I, and it inserts another point there. So now I have 3 spans. But I need one more point out here so I can manipulate this portion of the vector. So I'll come over here about so, type the letter I again. So what I've done is I've created a boundary. I can put my cursor over this point and drag it up here slightly, just for example right there. And all I've done is I've not changed this area of the vector, I've not changed this area of the vector. I've only changed this area here. And I can drag this point wherever I'd like to along that span. Now I don't want to go too far in here. So if I just zoom in a little bit here, I can look at my scale down here. And I can see that from here to here is about a ½ inch. So that would make this area right in here about a ¼ inch. So I've moved this point about a ¼ inch in. I think that's a little bit much in this case right here. Let me put it about right like so. Then I'll back out a little bit. So we've got our vector now running from here to this point. Then it's going to move in at a fairly sharp angle and then come back at a little bit more of a gradual angle. Now I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to put my cursor over the vector, type I, move over here, type I, move over here, type I. This one I want to bring up a little bit more over this way. We're just kind of making random shapes. Now down here I've got a very square corner and I don't necessarily want that to be square. So I'm going to throw in a few points here and I'll delete the ones I don't need. So I'll put my cursor here, type I, type I. So that's immediately broken this up into even more points. Now I can put my cursor over the corner because I want to eliminate that square corner. And I can right click, go to delete point. And remember the keyboard shortcut D. So I'll click on delete point. But now I've got just a little bit too uniform of a angle here. So I'll drag this one in slightly. And I'll bring this one up just a bit, like so. So I've got a little bit more of a deformed corner here. And in fact, this doesn't even have to stay right here. I can bring that up. And then I'll just go around my perimeter, making small adjustments. So that's our profile cutout. And I can come in and make adjustments at any point after I get text put in here, should I decide to. That's one of the things about doing something and designing on the fly like this. There are no rules. You can make changes, come in and add text, and maybe this is too far down here. I can make those adjustments after I get the text put in. To get out of node editing, because I'm done with this outside profile for the moment, I'll just type the letter N on my keyboard again, and we now have our profile. I'm going to break the text up into two separate lines using two separate fonts. My first text I want up here. I'll go into my text tool here under Create Vectors. The font I want is called Messy Annie right here. And I will leave a link to a website where you can find this font to download it if you're interested in it. I'll put that in the description box below. So I'll select that font. I don't want to use bold. I want it aligned in the center. And we see right here is where my anchor point is. Now it doesn't really matter because I'm going to be moving and manipulating this text. The size doesn't really matter because I'm going to be moving and manipulating it to fit in this space up here. So I'm just going to go up here, go into caps lock, and type "Good fences make good neighbors." Then we'll close this. My text is down here selected. I can click it again and grab by the center square here and place it on my center line. And that appears to be centered more or less. Now to resize it, I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to come out here to this corner, and that expands the text from the center. I'll let go there. Now I need to make it a little bit taller. So again, I'll hold down Shift, grab this center one and kind of stretch it out that way. And I think that looks good right there. So I can click off to deselect the text. Now if I come in here and look, I have some spacing issues. I have an N and a C that's almost right on top of one another. If I carve this out right now, it'll probably split out that little centerpiece. I need to spread these out some. And I have a few here that are spread out a little bit too far. I'll center that back up. Come over to Edit Text Spacing and Curve. We want to make sure that we get all of our kerning done, get our spacing correct before we convert this text to curves. Because once we convert this text to curves, none of these text tools will work with it because it's no longer text. And I'll explain what I mean by that fairly quickly here. I want to edit my text spacing and curve. And I want to go in here between the N and the C and select the text. And we'll see my cursor turns into the letter V, the letter A with two arrowheads in the center. Right now those arrows are pointing towards each other. If I click now, I'll be moving those two letters together. If I hold down Shift, you'll see those arrows change to pointing away from one another. That's going to spread them apart, which is what I want. So I'll go ahead and left click my mouse a couple of times. Let's do it 3 times, and let's back out and see. That gives me a better space right there, but it's not too much. Now I can come in here between the A and the K, hold down Shift, bump them open just one. That's good enough there. Now, by the same token, I have a couple here that are too far apart. Let me kind of give that one click. That looks a little better. These are a little bit far apart. There we go. That looks a little better. Now I'll click off to come out of that, to deselect that text, come back over under Edit Objects, and click my standard selection mode. We have that text in place. I'm going to leave that for right now and get my other text here so we can adjust and size accordingly. So we'll come back over here to the text tool. And I'm going to change over fonts. This is supposed to look kind of messy. This is supposed to look a little bit more organized. So I'm going to change to a font called Franciscan. So I type the letter F and it jumps up to the letter F in my font list. And I can scroll down here to Franciscan. Now this kind of has a rustic hand-drawn look, but a lot neater, a lot more organized. And I'll type in my bottom text here, again with caps lock. Again, I'm not going bold or italic. I want my text aligned to the center, and the size and anchor don't really matter because I'm going to be changing that anyway. So we'll close that. My text is selected. Again, I'll left click it one more time, go for this center box, drag it over here onto my X0 line. Now again, hold down Shift, grab one of the corner boxes to kind of spread it out, and maybe make it a little bit taller. Again, holding down Shift. Now, I don't want this text to be as bold as this. So I'm going to bring that back in just a little bit. And I think that's a good size for this. I'm going to drag it downwards some. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to enlarge this text here. So again, I'll hold down Shift. Bring it out to about there. And I'm going to bump my text downward slightly using the down arrow key on my keyboard. And that works. That looks good right there. I'll go ahead and bring that up slightly, hitting the up arrow on my keyboard with the text selected. Okay, now you can see here that I'm not exactly centered. This text is a little bit larger than this text, and that's the way I want this. That's going to be just fine. From here, I could very easily just go over and start calculating toolpaths. However, there's one little thing that bothers me, and that is if we look at this text specifically, it's supposed to look messy, hand-drawn, handwritten, but if we look at all these O's, and there are a few, they're all identical. They're supposed to be messy, but they all have this little bump out right here, all in the same spot. The letter D all has this little corner angle in the same spot. The letter G, it looks too consistent. It looks machine made. We don't want that. So in order to kind of customize this font, I'm going to need to do some node editing. If I were to select the text now, type the letter N on my keyboard to go into node editing, nothing happens. It just deselects the text. I'm in node editing, but I can't select the text. To node edit text, the text must be converted to curves. But once converted, the text will no longer be editable as text. Do you want to convert? No, not yet. I don't want to convert. Let me type the letter N to get out of node editing mode. And this is what I was talking about earlier. We need to make sure that we have all of our text formatting finished. And I can see right here that I do need to spread this H and this B apart. So let me go back up here. We'll go in between the H and B, hold down Shift, kind of open those up a little bit more. Now I think I'm ready to convert this to curves so that I can edit the font. Again, we'll click off to deselect, go back over to standard selection mode. To convert this to curves, I have a couple of ways of doing it. One is I can just select the text, right-click, convert to curves. Click off. The other way is to select the text and come over here to this icon, convert the selected object to curves. If I click on that, suddenly I go from solid pink lines to dotted pink lines. This is no longer text. If I deselect, I can come in and I can select each individual portion, each individual vector in each character. But because it's now all editable vectors, it's the same as any other vector. But again, I can't use any of my text tools to edit. For instance, I can't come down between this G and this H, edit text spacing and curve, select this, it won't let me select it. It's no longer a text object. So what I'll have to do is either, let me go back into standard selection mode here, I would either have to undo that convert text to curves, which I can do, undo convert to curves, or I can manipulate the text using standard vector tools. What I mean by that is if I select all of these vectors over here, because that's what they are now, I can zoom in and using the cursor keys on my keyboard kind of bump this over to the right and adjust that spacing. Now, in this particular case, either one of those would have been an acceptable move. Because I had just recently converted these to curves, it would have been just a little easier to go ahead and undo that convert to curves and use my edit text spacing to do this. But if you happen to be several steps beyond that, if I had converted these to curves and then made a whole series of changes, put another hour's worth of work into the sign, that may not be an option. I would have to undo everything I had already done in order to go back to be able to use that text tool. So now let's get in and kind of do a little bit of node editing on these to make these O's less identical to one another and kind of customize the font a little bit. So we'll start with this one right here. I'm going to leave it alone. but I'm going to change the second one here. So I'll select the inside of this O, go into node editing, and I'll make a very simple change by dragging that up here to eliminate this point. I'll grab my start point and bring it down to about there. So those two quick little changes, this O is now different from this O. I will also go ahead and select this vector, the outside vector, and I'll eliminate that point right there. So I've got a straight side. Now these are no longer identical. So I can click off of those vectors and we see that they're just different enough to where they no longer look machine made. Generally speaking, if you're going to do any kind of editing like this, you're trying to make things look a little less identical, leave the first instance alone. They don't all have to be changed from the original font. So I've got this letter G, I'm going to leave it alone. I've got the D, I'm going to leave that alone. But I have these two E's fairly close together. And I just want to make subtle changes. So I'm going to leave the first one alone, but I will come up and I'll play with this second one a little bit. And like I say, I'll just make some very small changes. The changes are subtle, but they're no longer identical. They don't look machine made. And this is all 100% personal preference. It's very abstract. You can leave these if you prefer. You can make things wider or narrower as you see fit. But the point is, in this case for me, to make it look a little more handmade and less cookie cutter, less machined out. And I believe that these letters here are far enough away from these to where you wouldn't really get the impression that it looks too cookie cutter. Let me center that up and see what I think here. I think that'll work. This G is different from this G. All the O's look just slightly different from one another. And the E's are a little bit different. I think I'm going to leave these as is right now. Now, knowing how big my text is and getting it placed where I want to place it, I can now come back and I can refine this shape a little bit and maybe do a few more little scallops here and there, maybe clean a few things up. This curve kind of bothers me a little bit, so let me select my Profile Cutout outline here. I'm just tidying up for me. I want this to look rustic and weather beaten, but it looks a little too machine made. The thing to remember down here, however, is that I'm going to be putting a screw here when I mount it to the CNC table and a screw down here when I mount it to the CNC table. So I have to leave enough space here to make sure that I can get that bit around here without hitting this screw. So what's an easy way to do that? I'm going to click off to deselect, tap the letter N on my keyboard to get out of node editing, and I'm going to come over here under Edit Objects to my measuring tool. And I'll click that icon, and what I'm looking at is this area up here, measure between 2 points, the distance. I want to come out here to this point where it's closest to the outside edge here. and I want to click on that point. Then I want to bring it over to the outside edge of my material. Then if I look up here to distance, I can see that I'm well out of the way. I'm an inch away from the edge of my material. So I close that. That doesn't draw any vectors. It doesn't do anything. So I know now that with this an inch away from the edge of my material, I can put a screw down in this corner and my 1/4 inch end mill can come right in here and cut, and I'll be just fine. Let's go ahead and calculate some toolpaths and see how this looks. What I'll do is I'll select all of this text here by drawing a box from left to right around the text, which selects everything within that box. And I'm going to group them. Then with this still selected, I'll hold down Shift, select this text. And then I'll group these two together. The whole reason I'm doing that is so when it's time to select the text to do the VCarve toolpath, I can just click one and I've selected it all. That's the only purpose for doing that. So let's go over to the Toolpath tab. And I'm going to do a standard VCarve toolpath. So I'll click that icon. My start depth will be 0 because I want it to start at the surface of the material. I'm not going to do a flat depth. I'm going to start with a 90-degree V-bit, and we'll see how this looks. If I don't think it's carving deep enough, I may change that. Since I'm not cutting to a flat depth, I'm not going to use the flat area clearance tool. And we'll name this VCarve text. Oops, I forgot I still have caps lock on. There we go, that's better. And we'll calculate that toolpath. I'll make sure for my machined area color, I'll want to select toolpath color, and I'll select black just so you can see it. And we'll preview that toolpath. And I think that's going to work out okay, but let's get the outline in here before we decide that. I'll click off to deselect that, select my outside vector here, close my preview, and I'm going to do a standard profile toolpath. My start depth is 0. I want to start on the material surface. My cut depth, I'll highlight whatever is in there, and I'll type in Z, meaning my Z thickness that I put in job setup, plus 0.005, because I want the tool to go through the material, cut into the spoil board just a little bit to make sure I get all the way through it. Then tap the equals button on my keyboard, and it does the calculation and enters the total depth here. For the tool, I'm using a 1/4 inch end mill. That will tend to round over these inside curves, which is why I wasn't really very nervous about these inside curves. I know they look angular, but the radius of the bit is going to soften that up. It's going to use 6 passes. I want to cut to the outside. I am not going to do a separate last pass, mainly because I don't care about the edge treatment on this. I don't care if it has witness marks. It's meant to look rustic. I will, however, add tabs out here onto the ends. I'm going to use 3D tabs, 1/2 inch long, 1/4 inch thick. We'll click on Edit Tabs. And I'll come in here and I'll put a tab. When you see my cursor here, I can come down and you'll see the little check mark. It's letting me know that I can put a tab there. It's safe to put a tab there. So I'll put one there on a nice flat area that I can sand easily. And another one there. Then I'll come over here and do the same. I think I'll move that one. So You see how I get my cursor over that tab? I got that X. I can click it again and it removes that tab. I'll bring it up here. Then I'll put another one down here. Now I know I've got 4 tabs here to hold the piece of material together after it finishes this profile cutout. I can now hit close. I'm not going to worry about ramps. I do want sharp external corners. That's right here under the Corners tab. And we'll call this Profile Cutout. We'll calculate that toolpath. It's giving me the warning that it's going to cut all the way through the material. I know, I want it to. There's our toolpath. Now, something to notice is, in these areas here where I didn't make the modification where this is going to cut out to the full width, remember, because we're cutting to the outside of the vector, the bit is actually probably not even going to touch the edge of the wood right here. And that's okay because I want that straight line. If it does touch it, fine. Just be aware that sometimes the bit will leave the material and then come back in, depending upon how we have our profile cutout toolpath machined. Let me go back into it here. I'm cutting to the outside of the vector. That means the center of the bit is going to be running out here, so the edge of the bit can ride right along the outside edge of the material. That's why I have toolpath. Looks like it's not on the material. I'm not going to recalculate this. I'll just hit close. Now we'll go into preview and I'll preview that toolpath. And it has cut a couple of pieces loose that I can get rid of by double clicking. And there we have our sign. Now is when I need to make some decisions. I've got a lot of space out here. I think it looks okay. I need to run it past the client, the customer, and make sure that they think this is okay before I generate G-code and go outside and carve. I know in this case what the client, my wife, has in mind for this sign after I've carved this. There will be a little bit more distressing and finishing, so these large areas out here and in between in the middle here are just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that be. I'll hit Reset Preview. I'll close my preview window. Now I've got my client's approval. I can come up here into Material Setup. Now I can change my XY datum position to the lower left. None of this will change. Click OK. And I'm getting the warning. The material setup values have changed. Changing any of these settings means that all of the toolpaths must be recalculated. Would I like to recalculate now? Yes, thank you. And we're going to get the warning again that my profile cutout is going to cut through the material. Okay, I want it to. All toolpaths successfully recalculated. We'll click OK. After that recalculation, I want to go back into the profile, preview all toolpaths, and make certain. And it does work. I don't have anything shifted off to one side or another. My sign is ready for me to save G-code, go outside on the machine, and cut it out. I hope you got something out of this video. I know I kind of breezed through it, and I know it was kind of a simple project. But the takeaway from this, let me ungroup all this again here. I'll select it, come over here under Edit Objects, and ungroup. Then I can deselect, select that text, ungroup. The takeaway from this is that you can convert a standard font text to curves and manipulate those curves, modify, change them. You can get in and move things around, change spacing, everything using the standard vector editing tools once you have converted them to curves. However, when they've been converted to curves, you can no longer use your text editing. Because I've just changed this, I ungrouped everything. The better way for me to go would be to undo those changes rather than group them again and recalculate everything again. So we'll go up here to Edit, Undo, Ungroup Vectors. That brings me back to this point where these are grouped. Edit, Undo, Ungroup Vectors. That brings me back to this point where they're all grouped. The keyboard shortcut for that, as with any other Windows program, is Control-Z. I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to follow along with my further CNC adventures, or keep up to date with the Vectric for Absolute Beginners series, I do hope you'll subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to post them down below in the comments section. So I'm going to wrap it up here. As always, whether you subscribe to my channel or not, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to watch, and y'all take care.